Okay, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, gentlemen, for giving me an opportunity to do that. I like to do this from time to time, but also I think there is some, is there anybody that doesn't have one yet? There is,
The lights are by the door, that might help you.
it might help a little. There's often misinformation out there about equalization rates, and I think right now that's been heightened a little bit. So basically, what I want to do tonight is just kind of go over some very basic things about the equalization rate, and as Brian mentioned, we'll get into a little bit of how they're determined. This is not going to be exhaustive when it comes to that. It's a pretty complicated topic, but this will give you some idea about where we're at in Franklin, where we've been, if you will. I will be up front with everyone. I've had a little trouble with the presentation today, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, so to start off, number one, why are equalization rates required? A lot of times people think that it affects town taxes. It has no effect on town taxes other than the way some exemptions are calculated. But what an equalization rate does, the reason why it's required, number one, Real Property Tax Law 305 requires all real property in each assessing unit. So two terms you want to keep separated in this discussion is assessing unit, which would be the town. They assess, each town assesses. Shall be assessed at a uniform percentage of value. So state says all assessments within the assessing unit should be at the same percentage of value. But, as the next bullet point points out, each assessing district chooses its own uniform percentage. The law doesn't say what that percentage is, just says it can't be over 100. Now the next line is taxing district. So when you think of taxing district, it could be a special district, could be a fire district, could be a water district, could be any district. But for the purposes of our discussion, and I think to keep it as simple as possible, think of it as the county. The county is the taxing district, the town is the assessing district. So when those lines overlap, in other words, Delaware County has 19 towns in it. So now you've got 19 assessing units in one taxing district when it comes to county purposes. That's why the tax levy must be apportioned amongst the assessing districts within the taxing district. Hopefully that makes sense. You've got all the individual towns at their own percentage of value. Now the county is going to use those assessments to levy taxes. They have to find some way to make them equal. That's why an equalization rate is required. So, of the two calculations we'll do tonight, this is the simple one. How are equalization rates used to apportion taxes? We said why it has to be done to get the town's portion of the county's bill. So how do we do it? It's a four-step process. You take the assessing district, in this case the town of Franklin, take all the assessed values, divide it by the equalization rate, gives you the full value for the whole town, right? Now we do the same thing for the other 18 towns. We add together all of those full values for the 19 towns. Now we have the full value of the taxing district, which in this case is the county, right? And then we take the individual town, because again, we're trying to apportion the town part of the county taxes. We take the full value that was calculated in step one, full value of the town, divide it by the full value of the taxing district, which was calculated in item 3, and we have the apportionment. Now here's for those of you that like actual numbers like I do, we're going to hope this works. Okay, so you should have this as page 3 in your packages. Basically what this does is shows an actual apportionment from 2010. So what you'll see, and I know I'm sure you can see it better in your paper than you can on this. This is where I was having trouble this afternoon. All that happens is, again, we've listed the 19 towns, we've listed the equalization rate, we've listed the the assessed value for the town, the rest of it's calculation. We determine the full value for each of those. We determine the full value for the county. We divide it by the individual towns. Now you'll see out there on the last column for 2010 that apportionment was 3.9 something or other. I put in there a graph so you can see the portion. Doesn't really tell you much. But here's two things that may interest you. We can change the equalization rate or the total assessed value of the town and change the apportionment, right? So in other words, if I take, for the sake of argument, and we'll say that that year in Franklin, everything else stayed the same for the county, but the equalization rate was 80%, right? Now we go back out to that last column, and you see what's happened. Now hopefully you can see the screen. This you don't have in paper. Just by changing the equalization rate, we change the portion that Franklin would pay of the county levy to 3.79. And hopefully, I know we're going fast because this is not really going to be that detailed, but hopefully if you think about this later, if it interests you enough to do that, it'll make sense to you. All we changed was the equalization rate for the town of Franklin, which lowers, we raise the rate, lowers the full value of the town, which then lowers the proportion of the town of Franklin to the other 18 towns. Now the other way that that could change, the one that we have direct control over, right, is this number, which is the total assessed value for the town. So let's go back here and say that this was 77, which is accurate, that's what it was. And then we go here, and then let's say, hopefully I got enough zeros in there. Nope, let's try one more. So let's say now a group of properties was reappraised, was raised, right? So now we went from 173 million to 200 million. But the equalization rate in this case didn't change. We see now what happened is now the town pays a higher percentage of the county levy. You see how that works? Now, the thing to remember is, theory says, if one of these changes, the other one changes, right? I mean, you understand what we're saying? If the assessments go up, then the town is probably at a higher percentage of value. So while column C goes up, column B goes up at the same time. So it should equal out. I mean, there's two problems here. The first, most obvious problem is column C comes from me, and column B comes from the state of New York. I have some input in it, but they make that decision, okay? So you have those two things, and they tend to not change their estimate of equalization rate unless they have what they call a significant change, which in their terms is 5%. So in other words, if things change 2%, they tend to, in their analysis, not pick that up until the next year. The big thing, however, with this, and hopefully this is becoming obvious when you look at the spreadsheet, is if someone here does better at that, then let me know how you do it. But I have almost no way of predicting what that proportion at the end is going to be, because you've got 18 other towns who may be changing assessments, and of course the state changing their equalization rate each year. You see what I'm saying? So even though it's a simple calculation, it's got input from 19 towns plus the state of New York. So there is really no way to say, okay, if we do this, this is going to happen. Make sense? Somewhat? Is everybody asleep already? Okay.
Jim back?
Yes.
I know Walton just is going through a reval. They haven't.
They've done it.
Yet.
Yep.
That is done?
Yep.
Okay, I know Hancock just did it too, I believe, right?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
But Walton, their reval, so is their total assessment Do you have any idea whether it went up or not?
I don't have that here, but
Okay.
both of these numbers would change.
Right,
In other words, their equalization rate, in theory, if the state approved their project, they would be at 100%.
Right.
And of course, C would be much higher.
right.
The
So C would be like 400 million, close to it. Right.
you would expect
You
that.
expect to be in that range.
But to be honest, in my business, I've seen this a lot of times. I've seen it once badly in the town of Franklin, but I've seen it in other towns and other counties where the state's estimate of equalization rate does not pan out with number C when the town goes through a reappraisal. Because the reappraisal, in theory, is going out and appraising each property individually, whereas the state is doing a lot of number manipulations, which is the only thing they can do, to be fair. I mean, that's all they can do. But the two don't always go together.
Okay.
So sometimes towns, when they go through reappraisals, if they're not super careful, will end up picking up county share. Years ago, this happened in lakefront properties, unbelievably. Not to bore you with too many details outside of Franklin, but I was in a town where they picked up about 35% just because they did the reappraisal, and it was because they had major lakes in there, and the state really was not factoring that into the equalization rate before that. Now, if I can get us back to, okay, so we figured out how to do the apportionment, why to do the apportionment. And this is pretty, does this now come up this way? Yes. So this is, I mean, this is, you can get this on the state's website or whatever. If you go to, down to the bottom, 1996, I started in Franklin in September of 1996. So the roll that was filed in 1996 was before my time. The equalization rate was 32.45%. As Jeff knows, one of the reasons that the town wanted to go to a sole assessor and was looking to do a reappraisal and to get things up to speed, if you will. So in 1998, we reappraised. The new numbers went on the roll. The state gave us an equalization rate of 99.93. They don't do that stuff anymore. They would have given us 100, but in any event. And then right through 2005, we were at 100%. And some of you probably remember 2005, the last full reappraisal where every parcel was individually reappraised. And that was because 2005 was a year where some people went up 25% in 1 year in their assessment. I mean, it was a drastic change. And there was a lot of talk about it, and I'll show you in a further graph how that was a year when we actually got hurt on apportionment, 2005. But in any event, there's the history of it. There's where we're at now. We're at 99%. I'm just going to move right to the next because that's pretty much just. Yep.
Just a question, Jim. I see on that graph there, like, we went down to 77 was our low, and each year it's been bumping up.
Yep.
And that's, I know the state wants everybody at 100%.
Well, one thing to
We'd like to anyway.
Yep, one thing to remember with the 77, when the state does an equalization, well, let me back up just a little bit. The assessment roll is based on is always based on a valuation date of July 1 of the year before. Okay, so like the 2017 assessment roll, this year's assessment roll, is based on what was the market value back on July 1 of 2016. So, take that backwards to the chart we were looking at before. The 2005 reassessment actually carried a valuation date of July 1, 2004. Okay, so I know there's a lot of debate about exactly when and how much and all that stuff, but just because I'm arbitrary tonight, in 2004 to 5 to 6 and into 7, things were moving up briskly. Okay, so that's one of the things to remember. The assessment roll is not dated, is not valued as of the date of the assessment roll. That's state law. So that's why the equalization rate continued to go down for a few years, got down to 77, and then started to go the other way as our assessments were maintained, but the market had come back down after don't quote me on this, but 2007, 2008 in that ballpark. So that's why. Now, if anybody is not asleep, bored, or whatever, at this point, this should do it. This is, just look at a couple parts of this, because this, and I mean no disrespect to my colleagues throughout the state, but you would probably find that a lot of them do not understand this. This comes from the state of New York, Taxation and Finance, and each year what they do is in second half of the winter, they get together with each town and say, okay, we're looking at your data, we're looking at market trends. Based on last year's roll, this is where we think, you know, your assessments are, how they relate to market value. Couple things to take from this sheet. And there's probably a lot of things you could take from it, but that's above and beyond the scope of our discussion tonight. But a couple things to take. Over there in the left-hand column, you have major type A, B, C, and D. Basically, all you would really want to focus on in most towns, and certainly in the town of Franklin, would be major type A and major type C. Major type A is residential. Major type C is farm, vacant land. Obviously, there's a legal description of those two major types, but basically that'll get you there. Residential, vacant land, and farms. And just as an aside, I've actually argued before the state board about why they put farms and vacant land together. Makes no sense, because vacant land can be valued at its highest and best use if it's not being used for anything, yet a farm has to be valued as a farm. Two completely different animals, and they stick them together. No idea why, but they're not here to defend themselves, so I won't say anymore. So, what you get out of this is for major type A, and this is actually, when it says post PDC, state has stamped this. PDC stands for pre-decisional collaboration. Neat, supposed team building nonsense. It just means that they've discussed with me and we've kind of come to a meeting of the minds, but there is no real meeting of the minds. I mean, they make a decision and there's not really a whole lot I can do about it. Anyway, after they and I talked for this year, they felt that major type A, no quiz, but that's residential, was at 95.19%. And they felt that the farms and vacant land were at 91.36%. Okay? So I can do my own analysis and I can argue with them, or I can see what needs to be changed, where inequities are. But it's nice because this is another tool to say, okay, here's an outside source that's looking at this to see, you know, where is there some possible inequity. But again, this is between groups, not within the group. This is between groups, basically A and C. Now, if I can get the next slide to show. And this is not really a slide, we just want to go to okay, so hopefully we can get this to show. So all I've done here is I've said, okay, let's take a look at what the major type estimates on a part of this. Again, the MTA and the MTC, major types, comes from the state of New York. It does not come from me. I put as much input into it as I possibly can, but it comes from the state. This is what they're saying for each of those years where they thought it was. Now there's a part of this that I think many of you, and as odd as this is going to sound, most of you, some of you, a couple of you, I don't know which property you have, but most of you probably don't realize what happened in the interim, whereas a lot of the people up here at the table do because it affected them. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at 2012, the bar represents the equalization rate, and the colored lines that are both black in what you're looking at represent the major type A and the major type C. Again, 2012, nearly all of the vacant land and the farms increased in the ballpark of 12 to 15%. And that's the part where I was talking about the people at the table are almost in a group different from the people here, because most of these guys experience that. They experienced that 12% across the board in 2012. Farms and vacant land. Residential, that did not happen. Now you see, in 2013, you see the state's estimate of MTC. Again, that would be the farms and vacant land. You notice how it pops up to nearly 100%. So the state, the next year, catches up with that. The next year, they measure that and say, oh, looks like now the vacant land is actually higher. And then you can see when everything settles down in 2014, they're back to them basically being the same. 2015 came along, they were expanding again. The vacant land appeared to be assessed at a lower percentage of value than the residences, okay? We're not talking about huge percents, but we're saying that, yeah, it was different. So again, in 2015, across the board, the farms and the vacant land, this time it was not in the ballpark of 12 to 15%, it was closer to 5%. So, it's easy as a residential owner to not see those things. You know, for people who have a residence and have a vacant lot next door, let's say, and that happens a lot of times, people have two lots, one's got a house on it, one's vacant land next door, they would have seen that in both of those years, because they would have seen the vacant lot get raised, but the house not get raised. So these are things that happen each year. I mean, obviously one of the long-term goals is I want to see our apportionment for county purposes as low as possible. When you look at it that way, think of you as an individual taxpayer. Now I have to act that way when I represent the town. In other words, I want the town of Franklin to be represented the best as possible when it comes to apportionment. So that means keeping the equalization rate as high as possible while the assessments are as low as possible at the same time. Obviously, that's, you know, there isn't a magic wand to do that or whatever, but that is one of the goals here. One of the other things is obviously this measurement does not look at equity within the group. In other words, it doesn't look at all the residences and say they're all equitable except for this or that. The state does not do that. We do that, and part of that is to try to keep that equalization rate, you know, as close to 100% as possible. So I just wanted to go over some of the stuff with equalization rate. I know in the minds of some of you, I've probably raised more questions than I've answered, and I would hope that in the future you would take the time to, you know, get together with me in a situation where we could actually like look at the details for those of you that are interested. I know some of you are toasted.